I've never driven a McLaren F1. I'll take one of them.
I'll tell you, you get the McLaren, we'll join you.
Yes! What a cop-out. Well, hello everyone and welcome to the Evo podcast episode 2. We've made it to the second episode. This week joined by Richard Meaden. Hello. John Barker.
Hi.
And in Harry Metcalf's seat this week is Evo's deputy editor, James Taylor. Welcome everyone. Let's kick off. What have you been up to since we last met and spoke? John, what have you been doing?
Probably the most interesting thing was getting to drive a lot of Audi's heritage fleet. Some cars I haven't driven for quite a long while, and there was the takeaway car that I would have wanted to go home in was an original, I think it's a B7 RS4 with the V8 naturally aspirated engine, which was in Avant form and looked just compact and cool and sounded fantastic as well. So yeah, there was that. There's also a manual R8 that would have been fighting for the take home.
B7 was the first sort of cool RS4 because they'd started with S4s, that was the V6, wasn't it? The twin turbo V6, that's early days of Evo. We had one of those in, which was was it first car of the year as well, wasn't it? The saloon.
We certainly took it to the Nürburgring for the 8-minute Heroes story, didn't we? It was part of that.
Supposed to do a gentle lap in that, and Dirk drove it and brought it back with blue discs. I do remember the slightly awkward hand back. There's the keys.
I think they all ended up with blue discs. They didn't know the brakes weren't quite up to it. I don't think back then.
It took him a while though, wasn't it, to get the RS4 formula sort of nailed.
Yeah,
that's the sweet spot, isn't it? I think for those cars, that kind of era.
It looks great as well with those blistered arches, doesn't it? It's
no, they're
good
very
looking
cool.
shape.
I mean, fantastic V8 engine, revs to 8,000 plus, and a manual gearbox. Which wouldn't happen today, I don't think, would it?
Same engine in the R8 as well, I suppose.
Same engine, yeah. Sounded better in the R8, but RS4 is just so practical, so useful, such a handy bit of kit.
James, what have you been up to? I think you've been driving cars mainly in Wales in various bits of weather.
Yeah. All the seasons, one day. The most interesting and least weatherproof was the new Ariel Nomad 2. So looks a lot like Nomad 1, actually pretty much a ground up new car. And the first Ariel since the original K-Series Atom that doesn't have a Honda engine. It's a Ford engine now, the 2.3 litre engine that's also in the Focus ST. It's a really cool thing. It's a bit like the step from Atom 3 to Atom 4, where they kind of didn't want to change anything. They wanted it to have all of the ethos of the original car, but they pretty much have changed everything. So the chassis is new, it's bigger, it's got more space, it's faster to build, it's more reliable, it's got more torque, it's much faster, it's got all sorts of tech
much
on
faster.
it. I know.
Has it changed the character of the car significantly with the Ford engine? Or is
it's a funny one because it's ages ago when I drove Nomad 1, it was pre-COVID, I think 2019, so it's hard to make direct comparisons. But I suppose it was the slightly different Honda engine there as well, wasn't it? It was the one with more torque and fewer revs. And it's maybe a less kind of zingy engine, but it's got so much torque, and the one I drove is kind of switchable 3 modes for the ECU.
Oh, nice.
So they've got like one mode that's quite tractable for driving in traffic or driving off-road, and then they've got 2 mental modes, which is a lot more torque spread pretty evenly across the whole range. So it feels really
fun.
responsive. Yeah, I think it's still a car you've got to be careful in because it's got anti-squat and anti-dive now, which is really clever, but it still does the whole... It's still a mid-engine car with a lot of suspension
There's a lot of weight
travel.
transfer with those, isn't there, from front to rear.
Still looks like a 2CV in cornering.
Yeah, that was a really exciting thing to drive.
What else have you been in? Because you've hardly been in the office, so I'm not seeing you.
Yeah, no, I've been out driving a lot of stuff. Drove the Aston Martin Valor. That's probably the most valuable thing I've driven for a while. I try not to think about the £1.5 million price tag while driving it.
That's what insurance is for.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't think about that either. But they're building 110 of them. I think most of them are completed now. All of them to individual customers' specs. Fantastic looking bodywork. It's kind of roughly based on a Vantage, but
does it feel as individual as it looks to drive with that powertrain?
Yeah, it does. Even though it's got a lot in common with Vantage and some bits in common with DBS, it feels very much its own thing. And I thought it was going to be quite a kind of brutal almost car to drive because it looks so extreme and so muscular, but it's actually quite delicate. All the control weights are quite light. It's really kind of tractable and easy to drive. So it actually feels more of a kind of easygoing Grand Tourer than a extreme mad car.
And what's Alonso's version? The Valiant, is it? What's that going to be like?
Well, I guess that will be a bit like what I thought the Valor was going to be like. That will be the kind of more extreme, more sort of focused, kind of hardcore version. It will drive the way it looks, I guess. So that's the car we thought made no sense when it was announced, and now having driven Valor, it actually seems to make sense. Actually, I kind of see the brief now.
Yeah, see what it's for. I mean, they're both striking things, aren't they?
Yeah,
you see them.
As an object to walk around in 3 dimensions, it's amazing because it looks really dramatic in pictures. But I think it's one of those cars where actually, as you walk around it and see what they've done with all the surfaces as an object, it's a really cool thing.
Last time we spoke, Dick, I think you were arsing around in rear-wheel drive V8 Minis. Have you been?
Yeah, the
calmed down
Vinny.
a bit? Calmed down a bit in the last couple of weeks?
I had a rare week's holiday, but drove to Switzerland, which was fun because that was in my Fiesta, actually, ST200, which is not the sort of car you'd necessarily choose to do a 1,500-mile round trip, but I loved it, actually. So I think it's definitely the furthest I've ever driven in my own car, so that's quite nice. You get to know a car really well on those sorts of trips, so that was good fun. Otherwise, 993 GT2, which was, and a 993 Turbo actually together for another magazine, but that was just so nice to drive those cars. It's always been GT2 particularly. I think I actually prefer it to a F40. I think
Are you allowed to say that?
Or possibly not, but I think it's just such a special car. It's everything you want a homologation 911 to be, and you forget how boosty they were and just how aggressive they were, and very different from a regular turbo. Obviously rear-wheel drive, and just the engine is quite different. And I loved it, absolutely loved it. And weirdly, drove it on the same roads that I first drove one, which was with John when we drove all the 993 range for a Story performance car, which was
was the same car?
No, it wasn't the same car, but it was quite strange to be on exactly the same roads, but nearly 30 years
that
later.
Was an epic. We figured one back in the day.
Yeah, we figured all of them, didn't we?
Did 0 to 60 in 3.7.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And
so very
was
quick
good
car.
for it as well.
The rear-wheel drive
Yeah.
GT2.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was that with
a
the
monster.
959? You had 959 and 993 and a GT2.
I think that was a different test, actually.
Yeah, this was the whole range, wasn't it, of 993?
Yeah, from Carrera
Yeah.
right the way through to
Okay.
GT2, we had Targa and Carrera 4, everything.
Yeah, we did the tracking group shot under the A40 in London.
Hammersmith flyover or something, wasn't it?
Ridiculous idea.
But yeah, loved it, absolutely loved it. Really, 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 really special car.
They are very special, aren't they? I mean, you'd be mad to sell one if you had one, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you'd be an idiot. No, they're I think from when we drove them when it was new, that car that we drove, the owner sold it a little while later, and he's just bought another one, and it was, I think it's 12 times more than he sold 12 times more than he sold it for, I think is what he
Wow.
said. So they're like £1.25 million now, I think, which is worth every penny.
Yeah,
actually.
absolutely.
If you've got the money, you see it every time you walk up to the car. It's like, oh my
So it's another great shape, isn't it?
yeah.
Like,
Because it looks like a race car that's just painted in a normal car colour, doesn't it?
No, it's perfect. It'd be on my lottery list.
Proper get that era of homologation of, what does it need? It needs a wider track. We'll just rivet some arches on it then.
No, it's just everything you want from that sort of car, I think.
Yeah, so much character.
Anyway, back to 2024.
Living in the 90s.
Yeah.
I thought this week we would talk about, and John has touched on it already, engines, the internal combustion engine, which everyone has been talking about for what now seems a very long time, that it is dying, it is the death of the internal combustion engine, it has no future. But this year we've had, Porsche has designed, developed and launched a brand new flat six with a hybrid element to it. Lamborghini in the last 18 months have launched a new V12 and a twin turbocharged hybrid V8. We have Mate Rimmick commissioning Cosworth to design build and develop a V16 engine. We've got Gordon Murray with his V12s, again by Cosworth. Do we think the death of the internal combustion engine has been slightly exaggerated? We've got what we're seeing. They're they're not just the engines on their own. There are hybrid elements, but manufacturers seem to be still developing, still designing, and still planning for ICE engines going forward. What do we think?
I think legislation's coming for them, isn't it? Certainly in this country. 2030 is back on the agenda again. The Germans and the Italians seem to be hedging their bets a little bit by having hybridisation of the regular cars, which at least gives them a stay of an execution. I think that's the way they look at it. There's no point in designing, this was M5, no point in designing a purely ICE car because that will be legislated out of existence quite soon. So there's no point in investing. So hybridise it, and same with the other car I drove recently, the Mercedes e-performance version of the AMG Coupe. It's
just hedging, isn't it? I think it's a fallback. It's like a contingency, even though it's seen as they sort of build as a stopgap, aren't they? Because everyone's going to ultimately end up with EVs. But you sense just subtle the signals that CEOs and engineers, and whenever you go on a launch and there's a conversation around the dinner table or whatever, it doesn't seem as vehement their sort of route towards EV. They're all kind of, well, actually, I think we'll probably do this and see what happens, which I think is was always the sensible way to play it, wasn't it? I think if you commit to EV only, then, which a number of manufacturers have, I suspect behind closed doors they're probably a bit edgy at the moment.
Well, there's already talk about allowing, sustainable fuels, non-fossil, non-extracted fossil fuels replacements to be used. How you legislate that, I've no idea. But as you say, there's a little bit of rolling back on this absolute, that's it, no more ICE engines. And certainly certain manufacturers haven't committed. I think Toyota, and I think Ferrari, you would see Ferrari.
Yeah, recently Ferrari unveiled a new e-building, they're calling it, because it's a big new extension to the factory that enables them to build cars with almost every, I suppose, all three main types of powertrain: pure ICE cars, hybrids, and pure EVs. So there's provision there to create their own motors, and although they won't make their own batteries, they can assemble their own battery packs there. And obviously Ferrari has the luxury of doing that because of the way the company is. They can afford to create a building like that, which not everybody can do. But you really get the sense that them and everyone else are having to hedge the bet, seems to be the right phrase. Nobody's quite sure what the landscape's going to be like. And from an engineering point of view, the right way to approach it surely is to not go down one route and to try and analyse every option.
Yeah, some people have said that you shouldn't have just told the engineers we're aiming for zero emissions. It's EV. You should have given the option to come up with solutions.
Come up with the best answer.
Yeah,
which isn't
because
necessarily EV, is it?
No,
in all the applications, it's definitely not.
And I think perhaps the industry has been too good at meeting ever more stringent emission regulations, and perhaps some people say this is just another step in that process.
I think that you kind of feel sorry for the manufacturers because they're caught between, it's a rock and a hard place, isn't it? They're being told at sort of government level, you have to do this, but then they build cars for people to buy, and currently people are deciding they don't want to buy EVs in the way they were. Maybe the incentives aren't there, or people are just a little bit uncertain about what the car's going to be worth, or it's such an unknown quantity, and yet they have to plan. I mean, who'd be a strategic thinker within a car company, because their lead times, it amazes me how responsive car companies are in the way they can pivot and produce possibly the most complex thing we interact with on a daily basis, and you just expect it to work. They have to, and it has to be safe, and so they have to do that. Yeah. But nobody really knows what's going to happen, do they? I think that's
but it's fascinating of how they've approached it, because some of it, as you say, have gone all in on EV and not renewed ICE cars, or they've got a very clear, here's our internal combustion engine product range and here's our electric product range. But then you've got the likes of BMW, who with the new 5 Series has been designed from the ground up to be, it can take a petrol engine, a hybrid engine, a battery for full EV, and also hydrogen.
And they've always quietly been championing hydrogen, haven't they, for decades?
But they haven't backed themselves into a corner just for one market, as John's point of UK and Europe being probably much further ahead than others, and they've got that flexibility to adapt. And Ferrari building a factory that doesn't just say we're going to build a battery factory, but then others. Ford, for example, have gone all in on EVs. Stellantis Group, everything's going to be EV. That's their goal to strive for. But you do wonder whether there's enough demand and requirements from those people.
It's the question I get. Normally, if you're in a social situation or something, and he's the bloke who does car stuff.
He's the boring fart in the corner.
But you always get, what's the best car you've ever driven? And now it's always, what do you think of EVs, and should I get one? And that conversation has changed in the last few months. I would say there's rather than the conversation being around, well, the infrastructure's not there. It's a more nuanced uncertainty now over, well, is it going to work for me? What's it going to be worth? Will I be stuck with something that I can't get rid of? Because you hear anecdotally that dealers don't want to buy back. They won't take EVs as trade-ins because they don't know how much it's going to be worth in 3 months' time, and it's such a mess in that sense of no one's making really, other than legislation that's being forced on everyone and isn't necessarily the correct one size fits all answer.
I think the industry's been very good at addressing a lot of the challenges, particularly charging infrastructure. You now drive around and you see pockets of chargers everywhere. You think, well, actually, they are solving it, and there are however many thousands of chargers being opened each year and stuff. But there's always going to be another challenge, isn't there? And the one we're seeing at the moment seems to be the residual values of used EVs. It's easy to bash them, but it's the Taycan, which was a brilliant car, and it's still a really good EV, but the market is not interested. So all these first 2-3 year old Taycans are 30 grand.
I think it's pretty hard. You imagine being a sales manager or sales director in a Porsche dealer, and generally the sort of people that are buying cars at that level will have been a customer for many years, and then should I sell them this thing, knowing that you probably won't want to buy the thing back? And you look on certain online classifieds where there's famously like 700 of them for sale at any one time, and I think the cheapest you can get is like 35 grand now, isn't it? Can you really?
Is that partly because they've been company cars to start with, and they've got all the advantages?
Yeah, and then there is none of
breaks.
those as a used car, and it's not as good as the replaced, the next gen car, or it's just interim improvements to the car. So I think they have become more like mobile phones. Would you rather just flip into your next tariff with a brand new phone, or save some money and have one that the battery's half knackered and it doesn't have the functions that the new one has?
I mean, that's going to put a dampener on the whole market, isn't it? If you can't sell a Porsche, which is generally agreed to be a very good car. But the other thing is, it doesn't all have to be EV. That's the point, isn't it? And that's why these companies like Ferrari and Toyota are hedging their bets, because it's not one size fits all solution. They're going to have to come up with something for trucks, which looks possibly like hydrogen, but then it has to be green hydrogen, not hydrogen made from fossil fuels. So that's just changing the problem slightly. What do we do with our aeroplanes? Sustainable fuel seems to be the one for that. If you talk to people like Zero Petroleum, they're looking at cars, but the big prize is aero.
Yeah, I mean, cars and bikes worldwide. This was a quote from Piero Ferrari at the e-factory unveil. I think there's something like 7.5% of all global CO2 is cars and bikes together, and then I think all transport, planes, shipping, everything is something like 14%.
The consumer is always the one that's going to be penalised, aren't they? And the private car buyer is always going to be the one that's penalised the most, is going to be told by someone else, you have to have this, as they're in their...
Well, the framework's already in place, isn't it? Because in the UK we have to pay road tax or duty, so and it's on fuel, so they can just apply it to EV charging, I'm sure, at some point, so that it's not like you have complete freedom to buy a car and use it at will without paying for it anyway. So I think at some stage we're just going to end up paying more and more. And I think it was interesting, isn't it, that your intro, we can point to this V12 and that V8 and that's fine, isn't it? Because the people that can afford to run those cars would pay 50 quid a gallon for petrol if they wanted to use that car.
And they probably can live in a country which doesn't have the same legislation.
The hardest thing is now it's actually people that can just about afford to run a car. Like they'll buy a car that might cost them 500 quid and they hope to get to the next MOT. Where do those people fit in? You know, we love cars and they're a passion and they're our hobby and they're all the things but for a lot of people it's just how you get to work, it's how you get to kids to school, it's how you get your food, and I think that's where the legislation is wrong, and where the cost of electric cars, and that's where it doesn't meet in the middle somehow, to me.
But it's down to the likes of Toyota we've mentioned and touched on, but they a month or so ago, didn't they, announced a partnership with Subaru and Mazda to develop internal combustion engines to that point of smaller, more efficient. And you do wonder whether the amount of money that's been thrown at EV development, if some of that was sort of siphoned off into small end, how much cleaner would they be?
There should be a social responsibility, shouldn't there? I think amongst car manufacturers. So it's not very Evo topic, is it? But you have to start somewhere, don't you? When you drive cars, and where it just sort of ties my head in a knot, actually, to try and come up with some sort of clear route. Where's it all going to go? I don't.
It was interesting. Don't ask me how I got started to do this. The other night I was with my daughter looking at. So she's 15, and we're off to Brands Hatch in a couple of days for her to do her first sort of early driving, and sort of looking online at cars. And I was looking at sensible things of it's 2 years away before she needs one. I was like, I'll get you a BMW Mini or something like that. She sort of don't want one of them, and she was looking at old Defenders, and it's like, no, you're not having an old Defender. But it's that thing of you look at the price point and you look at what's affordable for your first car, and to your point of how you get the kids to school, get to work, shopping. You're not going to look at a 20, 30 grand EV. I think Dacia have done a £15,000 Dacia Spring EV, which is great, but they're in the minority. The cheapest VW Group electric car is high 20s, I think, or low 30s.
And I think inevitably there's the thought that an affordable EV has to be one that doesn't, it therefore won't have the range, and it won't have this and it won't have that. Whereas you can buy a 500 quid Focus and drive around the world in it if you want to, because it goes just as...
And anyone can fix it. And
I don't know. It's a massive conundrum, isn't it? Which unfortunately for us in our capacity as people who swan around driving fast cars, that side of it is great, and we'll get back on topic now. But I think it is interesting how they just make up a small part of an overall group emission number, don't they? So you can be extravagant with something, or it doesn't really matter because people are prepared to pay whatever they need to pay to indulge.
But there's always going to be, because there is that huge fleet of cars in the marketplace, there's always going to be cars with great engines out there, isn't there, still to enjoy. So sort of getting back on topic in a roundabout sort of way before I go down rabbit holes, what are our favourite or greatest engines we think that we've experienced? What are the ones that stand out? So to your point of you're the geek at the party that people come up to you and ask you, what about an EV? If someone says, what's the greatest engine you've experienced?
I think that it's quite easy to pick the real exotica. I think I remember when I first started working on magazines and the more mainstream cars, this is really going to age me now, but like E36 generation BMWs, they were the very entry level 4-cylinder cars, but they made beautiful like little 2-litre straight 6 engines, and they you could access interesting, refined beautiful sounding, nicely just talky or revvy or at actually quite normal mainstream levels now. And I think that was the same with Subarus or, I don't know, rotary engines, or we had so much choice, which I don't think we possibly appreciated at the time. But
The thing about those engines back then is it's a manufacturer decision whether it's a musical or an engaging sounding engine, because Mercedes making a very similar product, neck for neck with BMW, made the dullest engines.
they just droned away, didn't they?
Yeah, and that still goes on today. I think there's some people who just aren't interested in making a fascinating sounding engine. With the Italians, they almost couldn't help themselves. Everything had to sound good,
whether
even the little.
Alphasud or later a 5-cylinder Fiat Coupe or whatever it was, it had to be fun, didn't it? I think
It was like the soul of the car. It was, it was a part, big part of the character of a car.
But what's the engine then, Dickie, that when someone says, can you go and drive this, what's the engine that you most look forward to starting and
wow, there's so many, aren't there? But again, at the sort of fairly rarefied level. But I just wrote something for the next issue about the original Gallardo, like early pre-LP Gallardo. That engine is amazing. And the LP generation cars are fantastic, but there's something about that early, more Lamborghini engine that just has a bit more fire and grit, and it's just an interesting, wild kind of engine, which is massively exciting from the moment you start it. It's always there. It's always, and it just has such a breadth of character and delivery. So that's awesome. Early Impreza turbos, I think they had totally different type of engine, but very characterful, tunable engines. I mean, let someone else have a crack, but yeah, it's.
I mean, speaking of Lamborghinis, I think my favourite engine I've ever experienced in a car was the V12 in the Murcielago or Morthéalago, however it's correctly pronounced. But it was like it was in the cabin with you. It sort of filled everything with sound, and also growing up playing with Matchbox Lamborghinis and having a poster of a Countach on my bedroom wall. The fact that the block in that engine went back to the Miura sort of felt really special. And
I think it's a significance, isn't it, actually, when I kind of wanted to experience certain cars for the car, but mainly for the engine. So the first time I ever drove a V12 Ferrari, it's like, oh my God, it's a V12 Ferrari. Yeah. And that's the same with Porsche, flat sixes or an 911 turbo rather than a Ferrari V8 or a Lamborghini or an Alfa V6 or, all of those engines there's something really special, and you need to hear them and feel them, and that they have such different characters. And I think that's what we will never have with EVs, and what we're losing with ICE now is that they're much more homogenized, and there's less room for brand expression, or the DNA is being sort of diluted, isn't it? I think now it's harder to find those really special engines at lots of different levels.
Yeah, there's less sort of choice, isn't there? Your point of BMW had a 2-litre straight six, a 2.5 straight six. They don't now do it. It's just that generic sort of modular engine strategy that manufacturers come down to, which, yes, for cost, for emissions testing and legislation and stuff, you know why they're doing it from a business point of view, but it does mean that the generations they've spent building their brand on all kinds of things, design language, what the model is, its performance, but also its engine of BMW balancing 50Ps on their V12s, show how smooth they are, and that all goes out the window because it has to now fit into a box that's that allows them to carry on building the cars that people engage with and aspire to
we'd
and
said
want
earlier,
to.
hadn't we, about things being a least worst option, which I think when you had free reign of pure ICE engines and then there were hybrid models, you'd prefer the pure ICE. Now there's ICE and hybrid or EV, you'd rather have the ICE and hybrid because it just sort of holds on to the things you like in a car.
It's part of the car's personality as well,
I
isn't it?
think so.
We kind of infer a personality in cars. I think we think of
It's the
them almost
personality
like
that actually means something, isn't it? You can dress it in whatever kind of style and shape you like, but actually you sort of bond. There's some engines you like, some you don't, aren't there? I think half the battle, if you're a Subaru, if you're an Impreza boy or an Evo, it was whether you liked the engine or liked the chassis, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, and I was always more of a Subaru person than an
I
Evo person.
We've stood in the forests of northern England waiting for an Impreza driven by McRae to appear, and that stays with you. The sound is forever. I mean, I'm older than you. 'Cause my first one was the Quattro, 5-cylinder Quattro, coming through the woods. You know, the lights playing through the trees, and then eventually it arrives. Fantastic. But my engine would be McLaren F1. But it sort of goes back to your talking about the super little sweet 6-cylinder BMW engine, because that is the McLaren engine is two sixes spliced together. And that, as a 6, that was an amazing engine. I remember figuring that at Myra. And the way it changes character, the noise and the delivery as it goes up through the revs, it's just fantastic. And you'd never get tired of that. Put two straight 6s together, you end up with an even better engine, 6 to the power of 2, whatever. Put two 4-cylinder inline 4s together, you end up with a flat plane crank V8, and it's like a 4-cylinder. And now don't ask me how that works. It's to do with firing orders, but you know, some manufacturers make a choice.
Just the cylinder number isn't necessarily the
guarantee.
key.
Well, that's one of to the Lambo engine, isn't it? When it went to LP, the firing order changed.
Yeah,
which
it's just smoother, creamier. Still amazing, but it felt kind of engineered into it with pops and bangs, and rather than just having this inherent character.
This one's like two Quattro engines together.
But Honda early Integra, or Integra Type R or Civic, really early Civic Type R VTECs were ridiculous. I could not believe it. The first VTEC Honda engine I drove, because the step between when everything kicked in, and they were quite light, small cars, so you actually felt it rather than just heard it. But that was like a magical thing to me. It was so smooth, and to see that the number on the tacho, because most things ran out of puff at like 5,000 or 6,000 RPM, and this thing was just going and going and going. And that's a long time ago now, since I first drove that, but it's still something that you can hear it, you can feel it, you can see the little tacho with a little stubby needle on it going, and then just seeming to speed up when it does the last few thousand RPM. That's really magical, I think, remembering those sorts of things.
It's funny how some cars are absolutely made by the engine, and other cars, it doesn't matter what the engine is. Two Hondas there, the NSX with the original legend 6-cylinder engine, dull engine, fabulous car in very, very many respects, but not a great engine. And you get that with some Lotuses as well, with their V6 as well. But a great engine in a car that didn't work was another Honda, which was the S2000. Do you remember the launch?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Weird car.
I mean, you could hear the engine coming, because I picked the car up from the launch. I think it was in Nice, up the route Napoleon, and it sounded great coming. It's like standing in the woods again. You could hear it coming for ages, echoing across the mountains. And then I got there, and it's like, because the chassis
was hard work, wasn't it?
The chassis just didn't.
No, you had to do a lot of work for not much reward at all, was there?
But then we had an Elise 111S there, which is sublime little car, but the engine is, and it's a sweet enough engine, isn't it? But it's not the event. The event is what's wrapped around, what the engine's sort of bolted into. Two completely opposite thing. And then there was a Griff 500, which is like beautiful rear-wheel drive with a really lovely woofly V8 in it. And
that's why I've got my Capri, because for a long time I wanted to be able to walk into the garage, press the button and start it. And
one day you might be able to still do that, John.
The button's gone. We haven't done that story yet. We'll get back to that another time.
But there's also a Boxster on that test.
Yeah, and that's a lovely engine as well.
But it felt quite in that.
They're quite soft. They never had much zip in a Boxster, but it was sweet and smooth and
just
Sounded
always
great.
felt under sort of torqued rather than underpowered, didn't it?
It's an odd thing, that, isn't it? Because we would hope that these manufacturers who are hybridizing their cars would downscale the ICE engine, just make it a little bit lighter, try and balance things up again. Ferrari have done that because they made a V6 hybrid, didn't they? The SF90's just gone off sale, apparently.
McLaren with the other
Yeah. But when Porsche tried it, when they put the flat 4 in the Cayman and the Boxster,
Everyone resisted, didn't they?
oh my goodness. I mean, that was.
I mean, it finally had torque because the old flat 6, sounded beautiful. Then you had that lovely.
It's really effective.
Yeah.
That actually, if you could just like turn the sound off, so it was great. But it just had this weird kind of throbby, chuggy kind of.
Well, it had all the worst characteristics of an original Beetle, that they thought that's what we want it to sound like, is someone throwing a filing cabinet down the stairs with a spanner in it.
But the weird thing is, that there was a perfect example of how it could sound in the Subaru.
Yeah.
How did they not, say that's our target for the sound quality of that engine?
I do remember interviewing one of the engineers, but I wish I could remember what he said. I know the exhaust.
Was he deaf or something?
Well, the exhaust routing was really tricky. I do remember him saying what a challenge it was to route the exhaust, and that was the story I was driving at. There was a point to it.
No, I'm sure it is true, because it is. Yeah. But then the flat 6 has always had a really awkward exhaust because it all hangs out.
They
from
sounded all
underneath.
right, didn't they?
They're not bad.
Well, the new one, the hybrid flat 6 and the new 992 it's one of those weird, it's going to be a hybrid. There's zero driving on electric power at all. It's all there for added performance. But my God, the way they've integrated it and how it works with the engine it just feels like it's got the performance. We did the technical presentation. They said it's got the performance of a 991 GT3. You kind of sort of scoff when you hear that in a presentation, and then you drive it. Oh right, they're absolutely, and that's the characteristic they've tried to get into it.
If you didn't know it was a hybrid, would you know it was a hybrid when you're driving it, or does it just feel like a bigger engine?
Feels like it. So it's got the benefit of it feels like a large capacity engine when you need it to and would like it to be sort of quite lazy and driving around, and then it's got that.
But it still has
it's
the
got
free
that
revving.
Great revving.
Sounds
top
great,
end. And it's a mega. Sort of just for the 992, which we've been a bit cold on, and it's sort of been a bit hit and miss depending on the spec of the car. I think if the GTS feels like an all new car. It brings that 992 to life. And John and I, we've both driven the new M5 in prototype form, and its performance is staggering. You think, wow, 700 odd horsepower, and yes, it weighs as much as the Sun, but it's the technology on the car allows you to use its performance. But you do on that car, you do think, well, I'd rather you just took 500 kilos out and gave me 450 horsepower. Yeah. But with the 911, it all comes together. And you think, this is what the 992 was meant to be. And it just feels absolutely mega because it's got those two characteristics, that big capacity and that lovely whizzy top end that they've treated us to in the GT cars, but you've not had in the turbocharged Carreras. But you now get that. It's a mega engine in there.
Is there a significant benefit to efficiency as well, or have they done it as much for performance as they have for kind of...
So you...
They didn't mention that in the conference.
It's for the power it produces and the performance it has. It's more efficient than its predecessor. But for like, it's not a huge gain.
So
but
it's kind of more about the
it's
driving.
To get to the performance level it now has. Yes, it's more efficient if they'd gone down the usual, just wind the wick up on the turbos. But it's a better driving engine for the sake of it. It's a lovely thing. Fortunately, you can't sound like an old crusty or everything needs to be a manual, but you'd love to experience it.
You get a manual sweep of an engine, don't you, if you hold it in one gear?
Yeah.
High torque, low revs. That's where you want to.
The calibration with the PDK is really good as well. So you can, as Porsche do with these things, when they really get it right, it's absolutely, you can drive it around as a manual on the PDK.
There's something about it being a lever that you conduct. I don't know why, it just psychologically...
It's punctuation to the drive, isn't it, almost?
Yeah. But I'm intrigued with the new V8 in the Lamborghini Tiramisu
Tiramisu.
Hurricane replacement.
But they start with an advantage in that the weight distribution improves once you put the hybrid stuff into the car. So that improves. It reminds me of when Lamborghini, with their big car, they first put power steering into it.
Yeah.
That was when they went four-wheel drive. So obviously they had a little bit of torque. But that improved the car more than the four-wheel drive, just because it was more wieldy. Yeah. And that's what you're getting with these
I do wonder with the
mid-engines.
with the Lamborghini, like 10,000 RPM, it's a lot of. I know it's a very obvious thing to say. It's a lot of revs, and if you've got hybrid as well and turbos, how often are you actually going to have the opportunity to?
You're not driving a V10
I mean, I know
car,
it's great
but
to
not in a
have.
V10.
You can do it if you want to, but it's going to be such a fleeting moment before you're doing like a
to have the
bazillion miles
space
an hour.
to do it.
Yeah.
I wonder whether because even in a GT3 or GT3 RS or something,
The opportunity.
you actually shift up at like 8 most of the time, don't you? Because it's
Yeah.
I just want to get on. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But it's almost like the obsession with revs. Like I'm fascinated with GMA T50 as well because that revs to the sun and back, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I'd be interested to see how much of that you get to experience.
Not much.
How often?
It's completely different on the road compared with the track, though, isn't it? You do get the chance on the track. That's what it's. Yeah, that's the opportunity. But on the road, no.
I think if the GMA friend has one and you could drive around everywhere in second gear and still be a front page of a national newspaper of when you got done for speeding, because the revs and the performance are just so linear, but then it just picks up and up and up. And yes, to the point of it, where do you experience that? It is on the track, but then you want to experience it, and it's I think the best engines, aren't they? They're up there. They're not just all about one small window, are they? They're across the board.
I think we're
characteristics.
going way off topic now, but I think
unlike us.
If I try and think about all the drives of really great cars, like great drives in great cars, very, very few of those are on a track. It's always road driving because the road brings everything to life, and it's real, and it's not just going around in circles. You're sort of interacting with something, and it just unfolds, doesn't it? The whole experience unfolds.
And also on a track, you're using quite a narrow
Yeah, it
band
takes you the other way,
of
doesn't
the
it?
engine.
Using the other
Yeah.
end of that band.
You're not
So-
coming out of a corner in third gear and listening to the torque build, are you? With the,
We do still have things to engage with, don't we? It's just maybe not what we would choose.
So what are the disappointments then? If we've had all the great stuff, I think one thing we haven't mentioned is the V10, which is that oddball engine that very rarely appears.
I
but when
mentioned
it does,
in the Gardo earlier.
Well-
I think it's fine. But yeah, generally,
it's an odd one, isn't it?
it's an odd one. It's Gallardo, and it appeared in an Audi S6,
M5 as
and
well.
then
Well, it appeared in one
M5.
briefly before it blew up. Probably.
Yeah.
But,
The chocolate engine in the.
But then there's sort of two cars, LFA and
there's
Carrera
the
GT.
top tier cars, aren't there? Those two, which would not be right with anything. It's the defining characteristic of both those cars, isn't it? If it had a V12, it would be amazing, but it wouldn't feel quite right now because they are such a.
It's odd, the difference between a V12 and a V10. The V10 always sounds more urgent,
Yeah, it's sort of higher.
even if it's
pitched
the
almost.
same size engine. V10 5 litre versus V12 same size. It's a completely different soundscape.
And the psychological thing again, there was the Formula One link for years. Obviously, they're not V10s anymore, but they were, and I think that was part of the mystique of a V10, wasn't it?
LFA is nuts, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, and it's kind of the whole. It's actually to your point. They could have any engine in it. They could have an exotic V12, but the fact that they're V10s and they have that noise that it's not as it's quite sort of technical noise, isn't it, from a V10? The way they rev
It sort of
and
sounds like science or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just a clever, wild. It's just very energetic, isn't it? Some V12s can be quite muted, and some, like a V12 Formula One engine is probably the Ferrari or Lamborghini V12 F1 engine is probably the best noise ever, isn't it? But in road car terms, I think a V10 is, even to a very lightly silenced Lamborghini or Ferrari V12, they're a bit more harsh, aren't they, somehow, or raucous? Don't know. It's
And of course, V8 supercars just don't cut it, do they? I think it's because it just sounds American every time, doesn't it? Unless it's flat-wing cranking.
yeah.
And it's an interesting thing. It's the perception, and the V10 is definitely a rarer engine. If Audi and Lambo hadn't made quite so many of them, it would be much the rarer engine, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's also one of those manufacturers tend to do a V10 once.
Probably said something.
Yeah. You've done that. We're not doing another one. That was great while it lasted. Yeah. You touched on it earlier, John, with the S2000. Great engines in poor cars, but also, what are the great cars where it doesn't really, the engine hasn't been part of it. It's just been there. Mitsubishi Evo, the engine is not. It's there to do a job, isn't it? But the car is there's more to the car than there is. What other cars are there?
I think one of the, and I'm probably going to upset a lot of fanboys here, but the one of the best looking cars I think Japan has ever produced is the early 90s RX-7. Lovely, smooth, flowing shape. And it's got a wankle. It's got a rotary engine, which is the dullest thing. The dullest thing. People say, oh, but they rev so sweetly. And they get to the top and there's a buzzer. It's like, some
Like
door
a quiz
buzzer.
show buzzer.
Yeah. Oh, time to change gear. So I really was, and the RX-8 that followed, you've got a dull sounding engine that drinks oil. It's not really going well, is it? In theory, it's really efficient and super smooth, no reciprocating parts. It all adds up to a great experience. But so many people have been down that route, haven't they, and not been able to make it work.
The race engine is like there's no internal. It's just like a light switch. It's absolutely, and because it revs so high, you kind of think it's going to be gutless, but it's got loads of grunt as well. So
how many rotors has it got? Is it 4?
Four on the 787.
Yeah.
I only know that because I had to
It's
write
quad
a
rotor.
feature about it recently. I interviewed Johnny Herbert about racing it, and he said it was he described it as being like a piece of silk. He said it was so smooth.
Yeah, a stunning thing.
And he said for the whole, obviously he didn't drive the 24 hours, but the whole race, every time he drove it, he never once had the back end slide on the car because he could be so precise with it.
Absolutely wild.
And,
wild thing. Everyone should drive one of those.
I look forward to
What,
the
787B?
Yeah, just a really hot rotary engine.
Maybe we can get a long term, Steve. See if Master will.
Evo track days. I'm sure it won't break the noise limit at Goodwood. What others are the? Because same era of that RX-7 is, again, will upset the purists, but the 968 Club Sport, great car, but a drony 3-litre 4-cylinder engine.
Wasn't it the biggest four-cylinder capacity engine?
Yeah, they're quite big pistons, I should think.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. That is a case of an engine not defining the car.
Yeah.
Decent torque. It wasn't a bad engine. It just wasn't very exciting.
No.
But then that was the 968's role in the range, wasn't it? To be, a smaller, more affordable Porsche.
But there's still some today, i20N, which is sadly there's still some in the pipeline, I think, is the official line that Hyundai UK have said. But that's, those end products, i30 and i20. i30 drank fuel like
there was a hole in the tank. Yeah.
But they don't define the car, but they...
No, it's another car that could win a group test without having a great engine. And the i20 seems to have a very heavy flywheel as well. It's kind of lethargic to build revs, and then the revs kind of hang. Sometimes you have these weirdly slurry gear changes, a learner. But the rest of the car is so sparkling that you don't mind this slightly workmanlike engine.
Yeah, you could say the same of Caterhams, I guess, couldn't you? And Lotuses to a degree. The Toyota engine was, they tried their best when they put the Toyota engine in to make it free revving, but they, with all the bits that were available from Toyota in terms of gearboxes and final drives, they could only just make it work, and that was quite a frustrating engine.
Although with cars like that, because they're so small and you're so close to the engine, you feel like you're feeling it as it's kind of breathing and stuff, and that can make quite a dull engine exciting. The fact that it's in such a pared back.
And you can't. I was saying more cylinders, but once you throw a V6 in, the weight goes up, and you change the whole character of the car.
Yeah.
So you sort of they go hand in hand.
And the balance of that weight as well.
Yeah,
the
the
distribution.
very first K series Caterham was exquisite. I mean, it was the sweetest.
Yeah.
Only 100 and something horsepower, but less than 500 kilos of car. It was the perfect match.
The Ford and Vauxhall engines that came, they had like a red top Vauxhall, which was massively powerful for the car, but
so heavy.
A bit of a thug, wasn't it? And then the Ford engine wasn't particularly smooth. The K series was just seemed like it was if they commissioned an engine for their car, it would have been that, wouldn't it?
It was more suitable to the Caterham than it was to the Rovers it was designed for.
What do companies like Caterham do with, they rely on the big OEMs to produce millions of these engines that they can just pick off the shelf in a crate, get delivered, put in their car. What do they do when Ford are no longer building internal combustion engines? Vauxhall, their usual sort of suppliers have just got, we just build one engine now. What do the Caterham Ariel, what do they do?
I remember speaking to Ariel about the hypercar when interviewing them about the prototype, and they're pretty enthusiastic about electrification, and they said one of the reasons is there's a shortage of engines globally, and it's only going to increase in terms of, obviously, as we said, at the high end there's going to be these incredible new engines in the real top end stuff, but the mainstream stuff that you'd put in a cottage industry sports car is getting harder to come by. You can't get a Caterham with an engine smaller than 2 litres now because they can't get Sigma engines anymore.
And that's a great shame, because your supercar engines, all these new V12s and V16s, in terms of the mileage that they're going to do, and we've said this before, but it's right at the other end of the bell curve. They don't do any miles. They don't really contribute much in terms of emissions. And your Caterhams and kit cars and all those sort of specialist things at the other end are the same. People don't use them every day. So it's a real shame that...
And they don't get scrapped. You're not going to get all the end-of-life harm that comes from when a car
That's
scraps.
right.
So what you're saying is a V16 Caterham.
That might be the only way to go.
It's the way to save the planet.
So what are the those great cars that we've all driven, and we've touched on a few of them, but it really, the last thing you think about is what engine's in it, because there's so much. If you were writing a group test very analytically and you were doing a star rating for everything, and you got to the engine box out and it got 1 star for the engine because it just moves the car. I mean,
well, at least we mentioned. I mean, most hot hatches, same kind of thing, isn't it? They're by their nature, they're highly developed humdrum cars, aren't they? So they don't tend to have particularly memorable engines. So I suppose Mark V Golf, it's a nice enough engine, isn't it? It's quite sweet and it does its job, but it's not, oh my God, what an amazing engine.
At least it was better than the preceding engine, which was the 1.8T.
Which is, one of the dullest engines ever invented.
It was fitted to everything
in
the world at one time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Even the A6s and A8s, I think, had it. So, we should be grateful for that. At least it had a little bit of character.
I think Terra, there aren't many really bad engines, are there? But trying to think of a really high, volume built engine. So maybe a Z-Tech engine that went into the Puma and Focus, and that was much better than it needed to be. It wasn't like all the whole cars were better than they needed to be at that era.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? You can, if you are an enthusiast, which certainly in Ford at that time, there were people who wanted to make the cars fun to drive. That was going to be the USP. So they touched all the little points, but they couldn't really get anything more out of the Puma Racing.
No.
The great car, looked great. But wow, that really was in search of another engine, wasn't it? Yeah. Same with the Focus ST 170 as well.
Yeah.
Just another 20 horsepower and a bit more character would have transformed both of those cars.
Yeah.
So, and then you get the 5-cylinder ST comes along, and all of a sudden everything's great.
Well, that was the other way around almost, wasn't it? The engine was dominated the rest of the car was okay, but it's a bit overwhelmed. But it was always great fun because it was sort of hold on tight and it sounded
Sounded
Really
well like the TT.
Same
really.
with TT, exactly.
Yeah.
TTRS, there's an example of a forgettable car with a great
engine, isn't it? Yeah, that with the RS that we ran.
Well, they did a V6 as well, didn't they?
Yeah.
TT, which you sort of forget about, and that was desirable because of the engine more than the car.
More than the car.
And there was always the conflict, wasn't it, with the Mark V Golf, the R32, which is this lauded car, so nose heavy compared with the
I wonder if you
four-cylinder.
drove one now, though, whether it'd be like, oh yeah, this is really nice with this engine, or whether the context changes, so you appreciate that bit, which actually caused the handling issues. But
Yeah, well, it's the same with BMW Z4s, Z3s. When we drove the first Z4 Coupe, it was a fabulous engine, just in a car that was underachieving. But now, if you drove it, it would be such a character car.
I'd love a Z4M. I think
Yeah.
I think they're really undervalued.
Yeah, I agree.
Because it's just one of the. It is like half a McLaren F1 engine kind of thing, isn't it? In the car, and it's like it was never a bad car, but I sort of think, was it as sort of as we said it was?
But I think at the time, wasn't it? It was at a period where there was lots of other sports cars. There was Cayman was fresh. 911s were still quite obtainable.
But I think I'd rather have the Z. I think the engine, that engine, is better than a Cayman engine.
Yes.
Much, and the Nissan Renault 3.5 litre V6. That was a bit of a plodder, wasn't it?
Yeah,
actually.
That's a car that just needs a proper engine rather than a boat anchor, isn't it? That's the 350 and 370.
But the whole car was that character, wasn't it? The gear shift was really heavy. The handling was a bit. Yeah, it was a bit like the farmer wants a sports car.
And there was the M3 always overshadowed the Z4M, didn't it? Actually, I think E46 M3. Probably rather drive an E46 M3 than a Z4.
What was the Alpha hot hatch with the V6?
GTA 147.
Doing that down the road. Yeah.
front axe was sinking into the tarmac. When it's
I think that's in honour of the Thema 8.32, that car, isn't it? Another ridiculous.
I think it's easier to name. It is easier to name cars, sort of average cars with exceptional engines, isn't it, than the other way around? There's very few exceptional cars.
Four-cylinder Cayman, maybe. I still think that's close to being a 5-star car, even with the engine we all dislike so
What, the
strongly.
flat four
you just
Cayman?
wouldn't know.
It's like
would you?
No, you'd always have a 6.
You'd have an A110, wouldn't you? If you're going to have a 4-cylinder mid-engine
Well,
sports car.
that's another exceptional car with an unexceptional engine, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like a truly exceptional car.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter what we all, when we saw the specification when it was first coming through, and we did some development drives with the team, wasn't it? Oh, it's not going to be a manual. I don't think anyone gets out of one going, "Oh, it's not a manual." It's because the whole package is,
And it's all the things that we sort of when Renault put the DCT in a Clio, Renault Sport Clio, it absolutely killed that car stone dead. And yet a lot of those mechanical sort of touch, I know it's a different engine in the 110, but it shows how good the overall car is that we're not whinging about the engine. It's like mentioned in past. Well, it's not a brilliant engine, but the car's brilliant, so it doesn't matter.
which then, last tank of fuel, which engine are you going to pour it into? So I haven't given you any time to prep for that because I've just thought of it.
I've got 2 answers.
Do we have to pick a classic and a current car, or just anything?
Well, tell you what, let's make it easier. So you can have a classic, a current car, and a race car.
Oh, bloody hell. We'll be here all day.
Well, you had 2, James. You can start with that, and then maybe
One's a classic and one's a racing thing. And
There you
I'll
go.
think of the current
Think of the
car,
current car, yeah.
later. I think, in terms of classic, I think one of the best sounds I've ever heard in the automotive universe was years and years ago. Goodwood Revival did a race just for E-types. And I couldn't get a ticket for race day, but I went on qualifying and just saw this entire grid of, 30-odd E-types, flat chats around Goodwood, and it's one of the best sounds I've ever heard. So I think some kind of E-type, that 6-cylinder engine is pretty special. And then the race thing, my first thing I ever drove, really, I built a kart with my dad's, which had a Honda C90 bike engine. And I think I've still got it. It still hasn't run for many years, but I think I'd quite like to pour my last gallon into that and
You'd
Mm.
do a
probably
few more
get quite a
laps
long
on
way with that.
it. It would, yeah, very efficient. Yeah, good power to weight ratio. I'll think of a current car later. As you guys go first.
Current car. I don't know. I better get there first, hadn't I? Probably GT3.
Yeah, but which one?
GT3 RS, I think.
With which engine?
No, like current mod contemporary car, GT3 RS, like 992. I think classic car. If we have to choose different engine configurations, then I don't know, maybe an Alpha GTA or something.
Yeah.
So a 65 Alpha GTA, because that's a really special Revy or Lancia Fulvia V4 sort of rally tuned one of those is a stonking engine. And race car Lola T70. There you go. So 5.
You wouldn't get very far in that.
But no, it'd be fun. Yeah, 5 litre Chevy race engine is quite something.
I agree. That would be my road car. Would be one of those tuned V8, American V8, big one.
Yeah.
That hardly idles.
Just does that really lumpy.
It's just got enough flywheel to keep it going. I think current car, I still am amazed at the Ferrari V12 that's in the 812. It's in the Superfast. I mean, the amount of power it produces.
Where did it all come from? Like we
I don't know.
From a 550 to an 812.
I know.
With no turbos, with no.
Yeah.
It's not double the power, but it
but
might as well be the way it feels when you drive.
It's mega, isn't it? It's up near 130 bhp per litre.
Yeah.
And it's 6.5 litres.
Yeah.
And my eldest, Evan, has been in quite a few cars, and the full bore acceleration on the road in that super fast made him for the first time grip the seat. I could see he was absolutely.
They're terrifying things, aren't they?
Yeah. So why wouldn't you want something like that?
Yeah.
I think race car. I think you touched on it earlier. Why wouldn't you have an old Formula One car that revs to 18,000 RPM, whether it's a V10 or a V12, it doesn't really matter, I don't think. You listen to it and it gets to where idles at where a normal engine finishes, and then it goes and you think, oh, that's high, and then it just keeps going. And the crescendo on that, 18,000 RPM, is staggering. And the fact that I can't remember what the sums are, but I had to I worked out one time how many times it has to suck, squeeze, bang, blow each cylinder. And it's like 400 times a second.
I was going to say there's Dean's mum joke in there somewhere, John, but I wouldn't mention that. Sorry, Dean.
Yeah. But
well, I've never driven a McLaren F1, so I'll take one of them. If I've got the run of the imaginary, litter, I'll take that.
Yeah, it's pretty special, even as a passenger, because the air intakes come down over the driver's head, and you get all the staccato.
It's like you're in a sort of IMAX cinema or something, isn't it, with all the surround sound, and it's all around you. That engine.
I'll tell you get the McLaren, we'll join you.
Yes.
That's the neatest answer ever.
What a cop out.
Yeah, it's a very good cop out.
Yeah. Okay. On that cop out, I think we'll draw this one to a close. So thank you very much, Dickie, James, and John. Thank you all for listening and tuning in. And we will see you all again next time. Thank you.